let's just talk a few minutes about the SBA and some updates. In the seat in which I find myself in, lenders are continuing to be confused as to which documents, believe it or not, that they're supposed to be handing franchisors. I had several just this week, and they were asking franchisors to sign the 2017 documents, the standard addendum 2462 that is not valid for this year. And if those were used, the loan would be sent back and stalled. So as a franchise registry member, we're here not only to have you ask us questions, but also to give you the knowledge and specifically the confidence to kind of to push back when that happens and to ask us so that we can intervene. As you know, we also have a lender support person who can solve these issues by talking directly to the lender. And it's usually a one-call close where we figure this thing out for you. So, and as I said, I normally get 3 to 5 a week. So if your life is happy and you haven't had one yet, congratulations, but it is out there. Also, I wanted to say if you have been one of the few companies that actually did a new 2018 SBA negotiated addendum, a new one with the SBA, please let us know. And please send that over to us because there's no way for a lender to know that you actually have a new one if they're just looking at the SBA directory. So we want to make sure that we have those on file. Another thing that's occurred that's kind of under the radar a little bit is that the SBA has added additional risk flags to their lender risk monitoring. And one of the most important reasons we want you to know that is that we expect because of this that lenders will be more conservative in their lending policies, not only because lending is tightening, but also because of these risk flags. Now, these flags signal to the SBA whether they should audit a lender's portfolio. So as you might guess, an audit not only is very time consuming, it's very expensive to the lender. So for example, if a lender is underwriting franchise hotel loans that are startups, they're going to get signaled as a very high risk. So some of you are like, well, I'm not in the hotel business, so I don't have to worry. But the problem is if the lender that you are using primarily is, then there could be significant delays in underwriting while this lender is going through the audit. Just as usual, we come back to our standard advice. I know you've heard it too many times that franchisors need to have many, many lender partners, and we can obviously help you with that. All right, one other quick thing before we start the main event here, FASB. So for those of you, I'm sure most of you know, but what we are concentrating on with FASB is there is a new accounting rule. And it started in 2018 for public, 2019 for all other franchise companies, in which initial franchise fees will be amortized over the length of the franchise agreement. So what are we seeing? Well, to the extent that they can, a lot of franchisors are moving the initial franchise fees into specific services that are being charged early in the process. So that makes sense, right? Because therefore you're reducing the amount of that initial franchise fee that needs to be amortized. So just think about that, and if you've not discussed this with your accountant, we suggest you do that as quickly as possible because it is going to be effective January 1. If some of you have already implemented some things, we would love to know about it so that we can share with others so that other people can benefit from some of the knowledge that you have. So that would be fabulous if you could do that for us. And so on this webinar, and most of you signed up for that, we want to cover international expansion. And we're going to discover some interesting errors that franchisors have made, 5 mistakes that could jeopardize your efforts internationally. We're going to look at some very interesting case studies, and we're going to answer your questions and thoughts on how to be successful in international expansion. So I want to introduce one of our senior analysts, Ritwik Donde. Ritwik has a wealth of knowledge in our franchising world, and some of you looking at the attendance list have worked closely with him, and so you know who he is. But before FranData, Ritwik has consulted with global Fortune 500 companies on managing their pricing and marketing and corporate strategies for the United States and Asia Pacific regions. He has also been a senior business journalist for major newspaper publications, carrying out financial and strategy analysis for the IT sector. He's also published about 500 articles, news stories in India and the United States. He holds dual master degrees, an MBA degree from George Washington, an MA in International Journalism from the Birmingham City University in UK, and in addition to that, Bachelor's in Commerce degree from the University of Mumbai in India. And Ritwik has also previous work experience in India and the UK. And believe me, it is a privilege for me to have him here with us today. Welcome, Ritwik.
Thanks, Sharon. Glad to be here.
So we're Frandata. So as you know, we're Frandata. So I'm going to ask you just to give us a few stats, because we love data, right? I'm going to ask you to give us a few stats on franchise expansion.
Numbers. We eat, breathe, and sleep numbers at Frandata over here. So on international expansion, one thing that comes to mind is nearly about 38% of unit growth within the top 200 largest American franchisors is now happening overseas. And over the past 3 years, if you look at a little bit in the recent history, about 80% of the collective unit growth within these top 200 large franchisors has been outside the American borders. And that growth is expected to continue more and more as more larger players as well as emerging brands consider going global for the first time. So, just to throw a few big numbers out there.
Wow. Great. And I had asked you ahead of time because I love these little classic stories, who are just like little snippets of kind of funny stories, not so funny if it happened to you, but funny stories that emphasize you don't know what you don't know when you go into international franchising. Could you share a couple with us?
Sure. So one of the stories that comes to mind is something that a massage franchise dealt with. This was a while ago when they were thinking of going and expanding to Thailand, and they quickly ran into a stumbling block where, because of the country that they were going into with a massage franchise, they just couldn't escape that country's perception of what a franchise, what a massage means for its consumers, if you know what I mean.
I think we know what you mean.
So, I mean, it's funny if you look at it from the outside, but it's not funny if you are the massage franchise who is seeing that after spending a lot on the international development and then coming across this huge marketing branding challenge. Another interesting story that comes to mind is this happened very recently with a mid-sized burger brand. They were going to Japan, and as you know, real estate in Japan is really, really expensive because the cities are smaller, the population density is way more complex, and so real estate is tough in that market. And when they were going with their flagship store in Tokyo, real estate became a huge challenge for them, and they ended up opening their store on the 7th floor of a high-rise. So now you can imagine the branding issues, the signage issues that they might have to encounter when they were putting up that store on the 7th floor of a high-rise. How do you tell a customer walking the streets there is a burger place on the 7th floor? It definitely becomes challenging. So you got to think about those kind of things if you're going international.
Yeah, and it puts a whole new meaning on fast food.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you came up with 5 common mistakes in international expansion, and so I wondered if you would kind of share that with us and elaborate on each one of those mistakes to help us understand what we don't know.
Happy to. So as you can see, these are 5 most common mistakes that a franchisor could potentially make when they are going global. I just to quickly run through them. Using a one-size-fits-all strategy, inadequately vetting, the market that they are going to, a lack of understanding about what kind of franchise model should they implement in the country that you are going into. The availability of franchise financing or the lack thereof in the country, and then incorrectly measuring what the true value is of that particular market that you're entering into. Just to kind of let me outline those mistakes in a little bit more detail, if you will. So the first mistake is that a lot of franchisors end up making is using a one-size-fits-all strategy. Different market has different needs. Take pricing for example. What works in Germany may not work in Norway or Sweden, even though both those countries are European markets. This also applies to branding, fees, target messaging. All aspects of your franchise development strategy has this pitfall written all over it. For instance, France. If you look at the French market, it's seeing a lot of strong demand for gourmet fast food right now. Personal services, household duties kind of services, in-school tutoring concepts, those are in huge demand in France. But then if you go to the other side of the globe and you look at Singapore, now that market has more demand for franchises that are in the education services space, in retail space, or business service franchises are in huge demand. Healthcare is big in Singapore. So where you go next has to be planned right in terms of what the demand is and what your product is. And if you're thinking, hey, my product's working in France because fast food is in demand in France, that may not be the same story in Singapore. So you gotta watch out. Then the next most common mistake that we observe in international development is the inadequate vetting part. Now this could be on a variety of different levels. So for example, this could include a lack of understanding what the culturally acceptable way of soliciting franchisees is. It could be applied to government regulations around the industry verticals, specific industry verticals that you're entering that market with. For example, Sharon, let me ask you this. Do you know which countries other than the U.S. have a disclosure requirement in
no,
Europe?
I don't. That's why you are doing the presentation.
All right. So there are as many as 5 European countries that have a disclosure obligation. France has one, Spain has one, Romania has one, Italy has one, Belgium has one. So you got to know you got to get the regulations part right when you're going into a new market, especially if you're going into an internationally new market. Let's take competitive fee structures, for example, right? That's another potential pitfall, if you will. It is important to know what the right level of fees to be charged is. Most franchisors, as a thumb rule, determine their fees after estimating what the associated expenses are, what the closing cost of a particular international development transaction is, and so on and so forth. While that may work for a few, again, you got to know what works in that particular market. So, take the case of Japan, right? While master franchising may be like the most common alternative to go into this market right now, franchisees in Japan, are often deterred by high franchise fees. And no matter how successful you are as a franchise in any other part of the world, if you are charging high franchise fees in the Japanese markets, chances are, franchisees aren't going to come and sign up. Another important aspect over here is knowing who your competition is, and this could be both direct and indirect competition. And competition may not always be present when you go in, but you got to think about it in terms of long term. If I go in now, 5 years down the line, what's my competition going to look like? And then going back to my Japan example, that also applies here. Now, trademarks must be registered in order to be protected in this country, because Japan is one country that has a huge propensity to create Me Too systems if your trademark is not protected by the Japanese law. And that can create huge issues once you're planning to develop and grow your system in the Japanese market, for example. The next big sort of challenge, if you will, in terms of international expansion is around the lack of understanding of what franchise model do you implement when you go to a particular country. Now, most studies on international franchising have said there is about 80-85% of U.S. franchisors usually go in with a master franchise strategy as their typical approach towards entering a country. However, of late, we've been hearing a lot of U.S. franchise development management and executives complaining that too many master franchisees in these international markets weren't succeeding. Just to give you another number, because we live in data, close to about 20% of international master franchisees fail to open even a single unit as of now. And so the choice between whether you choose area developer or a regional developer or a master franchise becomes that much more critical in today's day and age. So, for example, an area development strategy may work for a single market, and there are markets out there like Eastern Europe or Southeast Asia where you would have to offer a single master franchisee multiple smaller markets. Let's take Subway, for example, right? Subway in France has developers rather than master franchisees, and they are broken out regionally, with Subway doing the market sizing based on population density, consumer expenditure patterns, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, offering an entire Nordic region, for example, to one master franchisee is not uncommon in Eastern Europe. Let me give you an example over here as well. McDonald's just recently signed up with a company called Terra Firma, which essentially operates a chain of country house hotels in the United Kingdom as its master franchisee for the entire Nordic region. So that would include Denmark, Sweden, Norway, all of it. So understanding which model works and which doesn't is very important, and catering it to the country that you are going in is equally more important. Another big challenge is understanding how financing works in the markets that you go into. So, for example, this is very similar to our U.S., for example, right? Here we have the bank credit report. Here we have fund reports that are assisting lenders when they're underwriting franchise loans. It's very easy to educate lenders out here. And franchisors may encounter that there are more international markets where lender education is needed more than what they're used to in the U.S. Take Australia, for example, right? There are 4 big banks in Australia where financing is concentrated, and then there are multiple smaller regional lenders that are not so sophisticated, but they end up focusing on their specific geographies. The 4 banks, all of them offer a very specific franchise accreditation program, which recognizes the strength of a brand. It looks at the business model. It looks at cash flows. It looks at a variety of different metrics. While these programs may be common with the big banks, these smaller lenders are kind of still getting to that place. So there is more education needed. For instance, we have our associate in FranData Australia that operates the Australian version of the franchise registry. And they help educate lenders about franchise performance and looking at different metrics, looking at the uniformity that a franchise has to offer when you're underwriting a loan, and so on and so forth. So in different markets it works totally differently. While you may have a very mature market like Australia where lenders are taking that initiative to understand franchising, there are a lot more markets out there where lender edification is still very nascent. It's still early stages. There are not a whole lot of lenders who understand franchise financing, or sometimes are even risk wary because they essentially think they are lending to a small business, which in all cases it may be, but there is a franchise associated with it, and that's a part of that education learning curve that we are talking about that's needed in these countries. Culture. Culture is also huge. Culture, international expansion I bet has opened a lot of doors for small businesses, franchisors looking to uncover new revenue streams. But in order to succeed globally, franchisors must learn to navigate, the cultural divides, if you will, whether it's sitting cross-legged at a meeting or just an informal response. These simplest kind of gestures essentially can mean the difference between landing that big overseas multi-unit master franchisee, huge investor, or just going home without anything to show for it. Let me give you an example, right? I keep bringing up Japan because Japan is such a fascinating case study. In Japan, decision making often rests with middle management. As owners and founders and the whole executive team, the CEOs, the CFOs of these multi-branded master franchisee investors often defer to the middle management for their expertise, for their analysis. But then if you look at, let's say, Eastern Europe, right, it's the seniority of that matters, who you're dealing with that matters. Or if you're initiating a business over lunch or dinner or drinks even, the hosting party as the American franchisor, you are going to be expected to foot the bill for it. It's not let's split the bill or anything like that. And these kind of small cultural pitfalls, make the difference between landing that franchise deal versus not having anything. A wonderful case study comes into mind when I keep thinking about how culture impacts. I remember back in the day, there was this American company. I won't name names here. They wanted to open a factory in one of the Asian markets where a majority of the workforce was Buddhist, and they managed to learn that a statue of Buddha, if they had erected that in the main foyer of the plant, employees could come in, bow in respect, and as they enter the plant. On the day of the opening ceremony, one of the guests observed that particular statue at the entrance was visible through the men's room of the factory, and the local workers were shocked when they came to know about this, and they just refused to set foot in the factory. So here's a company that has spent millions and millions of dollars on setting up a plant in Asia, flown its people over to make sure things are right. A lot of capital has been invested. They had to spend even more money on reconstructing the whole thing, and imagine the capital that was lost over there. Culture is one of the biggest things that we have to look out for if we are going global.
Wow, that's an unbelievable example.
Yeah.
Wow. So, all right, so that's great. You covered over the most 5 common mistakes, and they were pretty serious and costly, obviously. But being Fran Data, I'm sure we have some case studies that illustrate the potential damage these errors have done when we don't know what we don't know. So you've shared quite a few of those, but let's go into a couple of really good case studies so that people understand how this all affects them.
Sure. So let's look at one size fits all, right? That's one of the mistakes that we talked about. So let's talk about a case study that kind of addresses that. There is this, one of the largest global retail companies, again, I won't name names here, was challenged during its initial franchise growth years in France. They launched their first French store in Lille in 2003, 2 years after it first entered the European markets through the United Kingdom. And the head of its European operations essentially wanted to replicate their UK strategy of franchise sales in France, which was essentially targeting broker networks. But what they didn't realize was that the broker networks were not very efficient back then in France. In fact, they were just emerging onto the scene. And that created huge obstacles when they were trying to get hold of franchisees, trying to generate sales leads for the development team to go and pursue, in fact, trying to generate sales leads for the master franchisee who was in there. And it was creating slowdown in its growth strategy. So the company then decided to leverage its brand's international reputation by developing an in-house franchise development website that was completely and solely focused on getting prospective candidates for France. It was designed and it was rolled out with a very country-specific kind of language. The messaging, everything was focused on France. And following, once they implemented and rolled this out, about a third of the new franchisees then started coming through this in-house website. The company then decided to increase its investments in terms of local franchise development staff, having boots on the ground at the corporate level who were doing franchisee sales day in and day out. And then they started selecting master franchisees for particular pockets in France in terms of those investors who were sufficiently staffed with employees with a significant sales background. So, what worked for them in the UK, which was targeting those broker networks, was not working for them in France, and that's why I say one size doesn't fit all, and that's very important in terms of knowing each country's strengths and weaknesses when you're planning international development. Another case study, if you're looking at the vetting of each market, right? We said each market is different. This is about a British sandwich chain. They first entered Japan. It was interesting, indulgent food, quickly snapped up by Japanese franchisees. There was a buzz around it for the initial months. But then, just 18 months into its market entry into Japan, this company was then forced to close all of its stores and completely retreat from the Japanese market altogether. Because what happened on the public side of it, what they had said was their investors backed out. This particular company had partnered with McDonald's Japan when they went there, and they said the Japanese partners backed down, and that led to closures. But on the back end of it, what happened was after the initial interest in the product waned away, they quickly realized that their product pricing at a premium level wasn't resonating with the Japanese consumers, because the Japanese are very particular about what price are they paying for what kind of products. Over the course of years, a lot of different companies have had to adapt their product offering and pricing to suit that particular Japanese consumer segment. So, while Japanese customers may be more attracted to Western brands and Western companies, they are extremely price conscious. You will see a lot of fast food companies that are going into Japan. They are now pricing the product prices at a level where customers can easily afford them, because if they think paying for a burger, they're paying too high for a burger, they will just quickly cancel that transaction and move on to the next thing that's more in tune with their with what they can afford. Wow. As you can see, you've got to vet those markets. Inadequate vetting can lead to potential pitfalls in future. So that's important. That's a huge thing. And finally, one final case study that I have is around the value that you need to look for when you're going into a particular market. And this is a classic case study. This is about, if you go and ask a Norwegian about the German discount retail company called Lidl, chances are he or she will have an opinion about it. The Norwegian failure was a very, very unique case in Lidl's corporate history. It was the first time ever in its corporate history and this is, mind you, this is a company that is known for its ability to successfully enter new markets. They had to, for the first time, pull out of a country entirely. In 2008, 4 years after they came into Norway, Lidl had to give up on Norway, selling all of its assets to a competitor called local competitor called Rema 1000. That's another discount retail chain. And so what went wrong for them? Why didn't they manage to adapt when they are known for their new market entry strategies? Here, the answer lies in a combination of different reasons. There was a lack of research. There was poor strategic planning and execution thereof. They did not study the buying habits and the behaviors of Norwegian customers. For example, Norwegians have a high propensity to buy branded products. Lidl was a store that was perceived to be quite the opposite of that. Norwegian consumers did not particularly care for Lidl's proposition of low prices for their own private product labels. In fact, they actually sold unbranded German products at their stores. And from a Norwegian perspective, low price equals poor quality. That's how they think. And Lidl didn't actually take that into account when they were pricing or when they were going into that market with that kind of a proposition for their consumers or that kind of branding for its stores. So as it turns out, it kind of hurt them in the long run. And price, as it turns out, at that point wasn't a crucial factor. It was, in fact, the perceived brand value that represented more for a Norwegian. Because, mind you, it's a wealthy country. People have a lot of money in Norway to spend. The consumer spending is high. So you got to think about all of those economic terms, and you got to think about it from that point of view as well when you're going global.
Wow.
So, some of these are really amazing case studies.
Well, thank you. Interesting facts, obviously, and hard lessons learned. But I guess also, Ritwik, the point is don't end up being a case study for Fran Data on a webinar, right?
Yeah.
Best to come to us first, right? Okay, so obviously. Exactly. We didn't tell many of those. We should have. All right. We do have a couple questions from the audience, so just thought I would share those with you and see what you come up with. So I think it's a great question, actually. What do you think should be the first steps a company should do when considering international expansion?
All right. So you got to ask 4 questions when you're thinking global. Will the product sell well in the targeted culture that you're going into? Is your target market familiar with your product or your service, or are you the first in the market for the kind of things that you're going to offer? Do you as a franchisor feel comfortable going into that market? And finally, what is the in-country infrastructure like for you to go in and start franchising? I go back to my first example where I said, European countries that have disclosure requirements, knowing stuff like that helps you create like a pre-market strategy, helps you vet markets, for example. You may have 5 European markets on your radar. If you can vet those markets effectively, and do your research beforehand, it helps. It helps go a long way. And once you've taken care of that, then we should look at a more structured approach towards creating a business plan for that development. And mind you, what we've learned over the course of 25 years and of late with a lot of franchisors going global is planning at least a 2-year lead time for market penetration. You've got to do that. You've got to at least have 2 years lead time in between. As sometimes development and sales can be a very, very slow process. There are markets that will move quickly, and you will have your next master franchisee within few weeks of going in there. But there are markets that just they don't move that fast. They take their time to research, to do due diligence, and it can be a really slow process. So you got to take that into account as well. Another thing that a franchisee could do is build a website in local language. Believe it or not, while we think English is unarguably the most important language in the world, only 28% of the European population can read English. And that tells you how important it is to kind of create and build your brand in that local language in terms of the markets that you're going into. And finally, conduct your market research. Conduct your market research to identify your prime target markets. You want to find out where in the world your product is going to be in greatest demand. And we are here to help in conducting, any sort of pre-market entry due diligence that franchisors may be looking for. At Fran Data, some of our recent international projects have focused on industries that have gone from QSR to home healthcare to sit-down restaurants. We have local level analyses available in areas, in regions like China, India, Australia, Europe, Latin America. We can connect with people with boots on the ground to kind of get and kind of understand markets more intrinsically and more closely. So those are some of the few short and sweet things that franchisors could do.
So we've had, and I'm not sure we have the answer to this, so I'm not going to, but we have had 2 questions about lead gen in international. Do you have any thoughts on that, or is that not in our field of vision? I mean, other than making sure the websites are, because what you've said a couple of times is making sure the websites are obviously culturally well done, and
so lead generation. Yeah. I mean, lead generation, like I said, it's each market has its own ability to scale, and that applies to lead generation as well, right? Like I said, the British markets have a very strong broker networks. Of late, recently, brokers have emerged significantly in a significant big way in France, whereas master franchisees will seek you out if you're going into a market like Norway. There are huge you will find multi-brand investors in Japan. So let me give you an example over there, right? Talking about Japan. Most of the times, if you're talking to an investor or a potential master franchisee in Japan, they'll ask you one big question: do you have a store in Hawaii? Now, you might think this is a funny question for you to hear, but there is reason behind it, because Hawaiian culture is very similar in terms of food, taste, preferences, consumer preferences to Japan. Because think about where immigration happens in Hawaii. Most of it comes from the Asian side of the world. When I came across this, I was having a conversation about this. I was fascinated that franchisees in Japan are asking you whether you have a presence in Hawaii and how that store in Hawaii works and performs. That's more important. So, lead generation can be very market specific, and we can help you in that as well. We'll help you understand what works in a market like Japan versus a market like South Korea, where tastes could be completely different, and the strategy of lead generation could be completely different.
Wow, thank you. So I also had a question from a participant about, do you have somebody that has done well internationally recently? I'm not sure we can name names, but maybe just the industry or something?
Sure.
I realize that we really have just done the bad examples here. So,
fitness, for example, has been really successful. It transcends borders easily in terms of business model. QSR, especially with with concepts. I was just reading about this. Pokeworks just announced an expansion strategy into some international markets. I was just reading about it in the news today. In terms of brands that have gone global, yes, you always have the big ones like the McDonald's of the world and the KFCs of the world, where the numbers speak for themselves. But in terms of emerging franchises, there are so many examples that I can go through. We don't have enough time for this.
Okay. All right. Well, I thought that was a good point that we would just have
home
pointed
healthcare.
out.
Home healthcare is one concept that is increasingly transcending borders now, with a lot of aging population in Europe, in Asia, even here in the Americas. Aging population is becoming like a big question mark on how are we going to take care of our elders. Home healthcare concepts are looking in towards that demand and going into Europe, going into Asia to cater to those rising demand.
Good. Okay. So we have one more question, and then we want to be sensitive to time because everybody's time is valuable. So one more question from the audience: is international good for everyone? So I personally have had some emerging brands ask me what point, with their growth, should a brand be thinking about going internationally? So we have both of those questions really. Is it good for everyone, and at what point do you know that you should be expanding internationally?
Well, there are benefits and there are advantages and disadvantages to companies of all sizes when you're thinking of global market entries. Into each market, like I keep telling this, each market has its own appetite for expansion. Franchising is very, very attractive in a market like Singapore right now. Just to give you, again, because we live in the world of numbers, I keep giving numbers all the time. 7% of Singapore's population takes part in some sort of an entrepreneurial activity, and they are amongst the top countries in the world right now in terms of investing into new businesses. So in a market like this where you have propensity for entrepreneurship, a strong proof of concept sells better to a potential investor. Europe is different. Europe is a country where Europe is a region where people like to know how big your brand is, how big you are, how internationally known you are. They love to know the scale and the size of a system when they are looking at investing and when they are exploring franchise opportunities. So here, a massive international operation sells well. So each like I said, if you are a big brand, with scale and size internationally, Europe is preferably where you want to be. If you have a very strong proof of concept, a market like Singapore is a better market. It's really based on what each market's appetite is in terms of franchise.
And are we able to do that, to help people say, okay, this is a good time or it's not a good time?
Absolutely.
Okay.
We will have. We have the ability to have in-country conversations with people who are, boots on the ground. Our information, although we protect confidentiality of our sources, to the best of our abilities, and it's valued at the absolute echelon in terms of when we are having those conversations. But we are able to gauge through our market studies what's working, what's not working, what's the best strategy, what's your best foot forward should be like. Absolutely, yes.
Oh, wow. Okay, great. And last piece of advice before we finish up.
Last piece. Oh boy, I could go on and on this topic now. I really could. It's very fascinating, and
we can tell. And we're happy that you love all of this research.
Yeah, whenever I conduct these market studies, each new market that I study, it just fascinates me in terms of how it works. What works, what doesn't work. It's just fascinating to learn about these things. So, one last piece of advice: every brand's international strategy is special. You cannot have the same plans applied across all franchise chains across all industries, across all countries. If McDonald's succeeds in Norway, doesn't mean that KFC is going to sell well there. And your partnerships are absolutely critical. Who you partner with when you enter the market is very critical. Working with a partner like us, for example, helps you navigate those nuances that much more effectively and objectively. So I would say, partner up well. It would be my advice.
Good. All right. So hey, I love this this graphic, and one of my favorite quotes is "Failing to plan is planning to fail." And planning for international expansion is not like palm reading, which we wish it was, but it's just not that simple. And as you've been saying, Ritwik, there aren't any set rules of what to look at or to look for. Many of the franchisors I've spoken with that expand internationally, they do so because they get an inquiry. And they get an inquiry from a very interested party in a certain country, and it sounds interesting, and they like the person, and they end up selling a territory without really investigating the issues that we've just discussed today. And it often ends with a sold territory with either a failed franchise or no franchises that ever got up and running. And so I want to make sure that just because a lead comes in, and we talked a little bit about lead generation, that we certainly don't want to just say, okay, that looks good, and expand into a country without considering all of these other thoughts and mistakes and errors that other people have made. So thank you, Ritwik. I really appreciate your expertise. And for those of you on the call, I hope you found this helpful. And as always, Ritwik and I and the whole team, and that's our information there. We are always available for questions. We love questions. Fran Data does. And our international team is waiting to hear from you. So again, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I think that we will be, in fact I know we will be sending out, we did record this, so we will be sending this out tomorrow with just a little note to thank you for coming. And to those of you that didn't make it, some people that didn't make it, they will get the recording also. And feel free to share that. And Ritwik, I can't thank you enough. You're awesome.
Yes, Sharon.
So, okay. All right. Goodbye, everybody, and we will see you next month. Thanks.
Thanks, Sharon.
Good night.